Places like Japan have serious checks and balances on wealth accumulation. And Iceland has, well, like 3 people to spread that wealth around between. Now, that all sounds great, but of course, Australia has its problems. We are heavily dependent on all the wrong industries that have time and time again crippled other economies around the world. And we're also heavily dependent on all the wrong partners. We are simultaneously one of, if not the closest modern ally to the USA, while also being almost entirely reliant on resource exports to China. That is a strange position to be in at the best of times, but as global events unfold, Australia is highly exposed to pressure from both of these increasingly erratic global powers. Now, that may be bad enough by itself, but the bigger concern is that these external pressures will make it harder to keep a lid on a lot of internal problems that have been slowly growing beneath the surface. Just because we've managed to hide our vulnerabilities so far doesn't mean they're not there. And in the case of things like Australia's infamous housing market, the very fact that we've kept it going for as long as we have is probably making the problem work. However, beyond all this, it's also important to recognize the country's strengths. Yes, our most popular national exports might be unimproved natural resources, sketchy university degrees, and YouTube videos about how our country is impossible to live in. But you know what? At least we still have a trade surplus, and one of the largest in the world at that. So, how has Australia been doing? How serious and extensive are these current challenges? And finally, can they be reasonably addressed without doing more harm than good? All right, quick detour from economic doom and gloom. As I'm speaking, I'm actually traveling through Northern Europe, currently in Norway, which is just as gorgeous as you'd imagine. Hello to my 20 Norwegian viewers. And honestly, one of the few things I didn't have to overthink before this trip: staying connected. I've been using Saily, and it's made things ridiculously easy. Saily is an eSIM app that gives you mobile data in over 190 countries. No tiny plastic SIM cards. No filling out forms at some airport kiosk after a red-eye flight. I installed the app once before I left, picked the plan I needed, and that was a T. Even as I cross borders and bounce between cities, it just works. And honestly, it's one of those things you don't realize how useful it is until you're abroad. Checking train times, navigating with Google Maps, trying to find dinner, and not hunting for dodgy airport Wi-Fi or overpriced SIM cards. I grabbed a regional data plan since I was visiting a few countries, and it saved me both money and effort. And if you're a bit of a privacy nerd like I am, Saily also has inbuilt security features. You can block malicious ads, spoof your virtual location, and keep your connection more private while you travel. So whether you've got an actual trip coming up and want to stay connected wherever you are, download the Saily app with the QR code on screen and use the code ECONOMICS to get 15% off any data plan. Thanks again to Saily for sponsoring this video. So, just like there are plenty of individuals who've become rich by being lucky in unsustainable ways, it's easy to argue that Australia is in the same position. Obviously, natural resource wealth is a bit like winning the lottery. It's a fantastic opportunity, but a lot of winners end up squandering their money, only to end up worse off in the long run than if they had never had that easy wealth in the first place. Just like winning a regular lottery, natural resource wealth can make it so that doing anything else isn't really worth it, because it's easier and way more instantly rewarding to just use the winnings. Australia was not completely immune to this trap. Our goods exports are some of the least diverse in the world and are primarily made up of natural resources we don't even bother to refine, and agricultural products. This is a problem because it means a huge component of our economy is at the mercy of global natural resource prices and trade agreements, which are currently being called into question. Fortunately, our direct trade with the USA is quite minimal. We actually import much more from them than general global shift towards increased trade protectionism would not be good for Australia. To make matters worse, our second largest goods export is coal, which is seeing stagnant consumption, partly due to its terrible environmental impact, but largely because more competitive alternatives are becoming viable. Another common side effect of over-reliance on natural resources is corruption, because it creates such an easy treasure trove to pilfer from. Now, not to spoil too much just yet, but Australia's highly robust institutions have been one of the key reasons the country has remained so prosperous for so long, despite making so many classic mistakes. But even then, they're not beyond criticism. We've largely failed to tax our resources effectively in a way that would redistribute natural wealth into general prosperity. Rather embarrassingly, we have tried, but the lobbying power of natural resource companies won out against proposed reforms. If that wasn't enough of a kick in the donger, in certain industries we've started paying companies to take resources from us. Just this year alone, the government provided nearly $15 billion in subsidies and tax breaks to the natural gas industry. Now, this could be justified if it lowered local energy costs, but that hasn't happened. We've actually ended up buying a lot of our own gas back from international suppliers. It's a little bit silly. So, yeah, Australia has failed to do something that even Venezuela figured out relatively quickly. Then, of course, there's the issue of housing. Australian real estate is unbelievably expensive in our handful of major cities. There are a few reasons why it got so bad, and unfortunately, not much has been done to reverse it. For starters, we have a highly multicultural society that has been both open to and attractive for immigration from all over the world. A lot of that immigration comes in the form of people drawn to the relatively high salaries and living conditions offered in Australia. And of course, they need a place to live. But a significant portion also comes from already wealthy individuals from other high-income countries who move here simply because Australia has some of the most livable cities in the world. Assuming, of course, that the person doing the living is already relatively wealthy. In an effort to tamp down on this demand, the government has imposed a 2-year ban on foreign home purchases, which sounds like a reasonable policy. However, these purchases only represent a tiny fraction of total sales, and the ban doesn't include purchases made by people on residency visas, which is where most of the demand is coming from, especially given the elevated immigration levels. Another similar issue actually stems from a surprising strength that adds some much-needed context to our resource dependence. Our goods exports are pretty abysmal, but when services are included, we do a lot better. Service exports don't get as much attention because they're harder to visualize than ships full of goods heading overseas, but about a third of our exports are these intangible sales. The big one, tourism. When people come to Australia and spend money, it technically counts as an export because foreign money is entering the Australian economy, just like with physical goods. Even something like this YouTube video you're watching right now counts as a service export. I, an Australian, made this video, and my little business here in Australia gets paid by Google, a US-based company, as well as the US-based sponsor. Now, fortunately, we can't build an economy on YouTubers yet, but we have tried to build one on students. Back to the housing market. That ban on foreign buyers doesn't exclude people who are simply here on a student visa. Maybe that's reasonable. People living here, even temporarily, perhaps should have the right to buy the place they live in. Perhaps not. I'm sure the comments will be full of debate about that. But either way, this policy has encouraged a lot of people to come here not with the main goal of earning a degree, but to gain access to the real estate or job markets through relatively easy-to-get visa. To be fair, the government has significantly cracked down on diploma mills, fake institutions designed only to give out student visas. But even some of our largest legitimate educational institutions are now dependent on this influx of foreign students for revenue. Which means flashy, talk about banning foreign investors is more symbolic than effective. It's a minor inconvenience, not a hard policy fix. So yes, Australian real estate is a highly desirable global asset class. But to add napalm to the fire, our tax policies heavily incentivize property investment. We've already covered the mechanisms of negative gearing and capital gains tax incentives in our last video on Australia, so we won't repeat too much here. But the current tax structure is so tilted that for many high-income earners, it's considered irresponsible not to own 1 or 2 investment properties. This hasn't just encouraged investment, it's encouraged investment using lots of debt. Australia currently has the second highest household debt levels in the world, behind only Switzerland, which is a bit of an outlier due to their banking system. So yeah, while government debt looks good by global standards, the debt held by individual Australians is deeply concerning. And unfortunately, for most people, it's not due to advanced financial strategies. It's just the cost of having a home. Even for regular Australians, the push to buy a home is extreme because renting is financially brutal. Rents have climbed alongside house prices, often increasing year after year, whereas mortgage payments, even with rising interest rates, are slightly more predictable. Plus, a mortgage eventually gets paid off. Rent never does. On top of that, renter protections in Australia are weak, while protections for homeowners are very strong. Strangely, someone who can't pay their mortgage due to financial hardship is less likely to lose their home than a renter in the same situation. Additionally, housing in Australia is so expensive that it's become an essential part of retirement planning. Without a paid-off home, people would need an enormous retirement income just to cover living costs plus housing. Unfortunately, most government efforts to solve this crisis focus on the demand side, making it easier for people to buy homes through grants, tax breaks, or financial assistance. But this just increases buying power, which often drives prices up even more. Giving every buyer an extra $100,000 in subsidies usually just means homes now cost $100,000 more. We'll return to this later because maybe that's the whole point. Now, the final piece of the demand puzzle: incomes. Average Australians have some of the highest wages in the world. We have strong minimum wage laws, and although some businesses try to dodge them, they're generally enforced. But at the extreme high end, which typically drives asset bubbles, Australia isn't as competitive as places like Silicon Valley, New York, London, or Hong Kong. So we don't get floods of wealthy tech workers moving to Sydney with 6-figure incomes who don't mind paying $5,000 a month in rent. Our demand comes from elsewhere. So, tax policy, immigration, financial incentives, and economic pressures all create massive demand in a market that has consistently struggled to increase supply, which is arguably the bigger problem. Yes, Australia has plenty of land per capita, but not many major cities. Housing in many areas is cheap, but the housing where most people want to live is among the most expensive in the world. Inside these cities, urban sprawl, zoning restrictions, and all the usual culprits show up. And the incentives to fix this? Weak. Why? Because homeownership is still high, and people view their house as part of their personal financial portfolio. They don't want prices to go down, even if they have no intention of selling. So there's widespread support for affordable housing, as long as their home isn't what becomes affordable. Also, Australia is a federation like the US or Germany, and state governments rely heavily on the housing market for funding. Every time someone buys a house, the buyer pays stamp duty, which can be up to 5% of the purchase price, and that goes straight into the state budget. Originally meant to cover land title paperwork, it's now a massive income stream. This discourages people from selling, even if downsizing makes sense, because buying a new home means taking a huge financial hit. So many larger family-friendly homes stay off the market and supply stays tight. And finally, building is expensive in Australia. Construction is labor-intensive, and we have high wage floors. Skilled tradespeople are in demand, especially by mining companies offering huge salary. So, if you want to build a house, you're competing with billion-dollar resource giants for talent. So yeah, most individuals don't want to fix housing, states don't want to lose revenue, and the federal government doesn't want to kneecap one of the country's largest employers. Now, none of these factors are unique to Australia, but the country really has a potent mix of them that has made life for the average Australian quite difficult. However, it's important to address these issues in context, because part of the reason the problem is so bad is that Australia has so much going for it. The first key point is wealth equality, which is arguably the defining issue of the modern global economy. Australia does not have outstanding income equality. After taxes and social programs, we land somewhere in the middle of the global pack, significantly behind countries like Canada, which is arguably our most comparable peer. But when it comes to wealth equality, Australia does extremely well, only really falling behind nations like Slovenia, Slovakia, Iceland, and Belgium, which have far more aggressive taxation and welfare policies. And also, to be fair, much smaller populations. We also trail behind Japan, which actually has high income inequality, but makes up for it with some of the highest inheritance taxes in the world, making it much harder for generational wealth to snowball across time. So what's going on here? Australia doesn't have inheritance taxes. And all other things being equal, higher levels of income inequality should lead to higher levels of wealth inequality. If some people earn a lot more than others, they can save and invest more, which compounds over time. But in Australia, that hasn't happened. Not to the same extent as in comparable economies. So, why? Big disclaimer here, wealth is much harder to measure than income. Income is tracked and reported for taxes. Wealth, on the other hand, often consists of illiquid assets, cars, household goods, property, which are much harder to accurately value. And yes, Australia still has plenty of extremely rich people, but overall, the country has a more even playing field. Why? Partly because just owning a home means that a big chunk of Australians have substantial wealth tied up in the property they live in. And also because we have mandatory retirement savings through superannuation, which helps pull up the base, so to speak. Now, having a lot of money locked into home equity doesn't necessarily mean much. If every other home in the country is equally unaffordable, the relative benefit is diminished. In the words of Syndrome from The Incredibles, when everyone's super, no one is. These headline figures also mask a different kind of inequality that may actually be more damaging: intergenerational inequality. A study found that through various systems, a working-age Australian making $100,000 odd, about $63,000 USD, pays 5 times more in tax than the average retiree earning the same amount. That, coupled with the fact that older Australians got into the housing market earlier, before it became unaffordable, has created understandable resentment among younger generation. The good news, despite all the doom and gloom, Australia actually has a lot of tools it could use to address these issues. The real question is, why hasn't it? Well, the country is currently on the verge of a major election, and both sides are promising to fix the problems that they probably don't really want to fix. But that's something we've addressed in detail over on our geopolitics-focused channel, Context Matters. You should be able to click to that one on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.